Hello and a very warm welcome to Insight. I'm Amandra Bhatt. Today we talk about the third India-Africa Forum Summit, which is presently underway in the capital. This is of course the first event of its kind that India has hosted in terms of participation, with representation from all 54 African countries and over 40 of them represented by their heads of state. In the course of next 60 minutes or so, we discuss what to expect from the ongoing summit and India's engagement with the African continent. And to discuss the ongoing India-Africa Summit, we have with us in the studios an eminent panel. Please welcome Professor Sreeram Chaulia, a Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs. Welcome to the program, Professor Chaulia. Professor Chaulia, India is not, it seems, the only suitor that the African nations have. The US is there. Of course, there are comparisons with China, which has a significant presence in Africa. Then there is, of course, the European Union, Japan, South Korea. Where does India stand when we compare ourselves to other nations?
Yeah, in fact, there are some other countries, China and Japan have also done these kinds of large conglomerate kind of summits.
Right. There's one coming up in China in December.
The Chinese have one more next edition coming up. So yes, and then people usually do the head count, as in how many heads of government turned up at whose summit. And so insofar as that goes for optics, I think it's we are on par now with the Chinese and the Japanese, if not better. But I think obviously the comparisons will come more from a global perspective, because people want to know what Asian powerhouses are doing in Africa. And therefore, even though we have varied kind of specializations, nonetheless, the overall picture, the big picture people want to see is what is Asian intention towards Africa. And even on the continent in Africa, whenever I travel, people do draw these parallels. So while we tend to say that we are not in competition with anybody, it is a fact that major powers are converging in Africa for various reasons, because it's seen as the next big land of opportunity. And what they will do and whether it will lead to a tussle remains to be seen. But certainly that element of, some people tend to paint it negatively, as in there's a new scramble for Africa's resources. That's usually the Western line. The Western geostrategists tend to think that it's a kind of like sour grapes, because they are being edged out by the entry of the Asians, and so therefore they paint it as a kind of like a tough battle that's going on. We tend to say that we do different things, we can coexist. There's enough room in the tent for all of us, and that. But
India's model also has been quite different. We are more into a capacity building, development, partnerships.
So if the Chinese more hardware, we are more software kind of thing. So in that sense, we do differentiate ourselves. And I think one fact that stands us out, unlike the Japanese and the Chinese, is that we are a developing country that is also a successful democracy. Japan is an advanced, rich country, so there's no comparison. China is slightly ahead of us, but it's not democratic. So I think the democracy plus high growth that we are witnessing makes us special and unique from the African point of view. Not just the elites. Remember the aspirations of the African people. Africa is, has a youth bulge even bigger than ours. The average age is barely 20 years there on the continent. So, and then remember, Sub-Saharan Africa and subcontinent of South Asia are roughly similar in terms of poverty levels and malnutrition, all the development indices. So at a time when we are both on the ascent, it looks like there's more that we can offer and take from Africa than either China or Japan.
Professor Chaulia, I'll continue with you. Let's focus on issues such as terrorism, UNSC reform, and so on that came up yesterday during the foreign ministers meeting. What sort of cooperation are we looking at in the area of counter-terrorism? Because that seems to be a common challenge, a common threat that Africa and India are faced with.
Yes, absolutely. The Cameroonians have actually explicitly asked India to be involved with countering Boko Haram, which has now become a kind of a multinational menace, because in Chad, it's in Cameroon, it's of course in Nigeria. So I think we need to support them differently. One is special forces, the ones who are elite, commander units. We've been doing a little bit with the Nigerians, training some of them. Our Air Force has done it, and it's interesting that the current Nigerian president, who's been elected, through a great historic transfer of power through democratic elections, Muhammadu Buhari studied at our defense college in Tamil Nadu. So we need to leverage this. Remember we say these things, Hamid Karzai studied in India, that kind of thing. So it's not just that. A lot of African elites today have over the last 20-30 years been here. And President Buhari has a military background himself. And now I think it's the right time to ramp up our training component at the defense level. That is one. The second, of course, is the transnational nature of some of these terrorist groups. Al-Shabaab, for example, is very close to, is supposed to be affiliated to Al-Qaeda. And there is Islamic State branches in 2 to 3 African countries. So all these mean that there is room for us to support each other, especially at the level of military training, and also sharing tips about movement of these terrorist groups, movement of drugs, movement of weapons, all of which fuel terrorist activity. There is also an issue of coordination, especially when you have these transnational threats. Sometimes we've noticed that even though there are regional bodies like ECOWAS in Western Africa, they are not all on the same page, and sometimes they have narrow nationalistic rivalries among the elites of these countries. And I would suggest that we should offer our good officers to help coordinate some of these problems, and maybe these are some of the things which are bolder diplomatic moves, instead of simply saying that we leave it to the Africans. And I always believe that we should proactively suggest something. We can't just sit back and say the Africans decide, which is fine. Ultimately Africans decide, but we must propose more initiatives and new ideas. So our Navy, we have defense agreements with Kenya, with Mozambique, of course we have always been important in supporting the coastal security of Mauritius and Seychelles. So the Western Indian Ocean, from the Bay of Bengal westwards, our Navy is playing a more important role to secure Africa. And there also, remember the pirates.
There's also an increased Chinese presence there.
They are also there in the name of counter-piracy. But the piracy has also been linked to some of these terrorist groups in terms of their income. For example, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. So the Somali president has made a very interesting, he is also a product of the Indian education system. He has asked for help from the international community to counter overfishing by trawlers, that have been like sweeping up the entire seaboard of the coast and depleting the stocks, and thereby creating incentives for youth to join piracy and terrorist groups. So for our Navy can do it, and who are these trawlers, who are these industrial trawlers and overfishers? It's mostly European Western ones, So clearly they have not been able to rein these groups in despite multiple appeals. So the argument is fine that Somalia needs to be fixed, as in on the land, through conciliation, and they're all divided, that's true. But then the threats at sea, which then multiply into terrorism and other forms of armed conflicts and uprisings, also need to be addressed. And I think we have a great defense potential there.
Right, and we are also talking about cultivating the blue economy at the same time. So
fisheries is very much part of the blue economy, and energy, offshore oil blocks and so on are also threatened by kidnapping gangs for ransom and so on. And increasingly we're dependent on Africa for our energy needs. So I think they're also, we're buying a lot from Nigeria, Angola, but even the west coast of Africa has got very high quality oil, and eventually we will need all this. We want to diversify away from the Middle East, and for all that to happen, there must be a kind of a strategic dimension to this. It's not purely an economic cooperation that we're talking about. It will involve joint coordination between African governments, African militaries, and ours.
Right.
And the peacekeeping aspect is again another central security issue where we have been talking, and the Africans have just launched their own standby force. They want 25,000 fully trained from across the continent, ready for emergencies wherever they erupt, so that it reduces their dependence on the UN Security Council permanent members and donors and all of that. And there, South African defense forces are taking the lead. But compared with South African military, our military has much longer experience and knowledge and know-how about peacekeeping operations, do's and don'ts, as well as how to win the hearts and minds of local people and take them along during these missions, how to counter extremist groups and provocateurs who may be trying to break down ceasefires. So our current and retired military staff, for example, can be ideal, and they have been doing training some. We have agreed with the US to also train African peacekeepers, but I think more is needed on that front The MEA has been saying that we also want to increase the gender component in our peacekeeping efforts. And already, as you know, there is a sole women's contingent in Liberia. So all these mean that I think we can make qualitative difference to build the African capacity in this region. Because often the problem with Africa, although it's been changing, has been, you know, these so-called rebellions or uprisings against states. And some people argue that the states have been artificially carved up and they are not really representative of the true loyalties of people. But whatever it is, the point is that that means that peacekeeping and even peacemaking, this is where India can make huge contribution. We've got, you know, the South Africans must take the lead, but then we can also support it, you know, from outside. And that's going to be crucial because our know-how in peacekeeping is unparalleled. You know, the Bangladeshis send a lot of warm bodies, probably more than us, but they don't have the kind of peacekeeping leadership skills and the training institution that we can, develop for the Africans.
I'd also like your views on the issue of UN Security Council reform, something which is, you know, a common issue for India and Africa. Of course, barring Egypt and Nigeria, which are part of this so-called coffee club countries that are opposed to an expansion of Professor Chaulia.
Yeah, on the Security Council, you know, now we have gone, you know, we have achieved a kind of a triumph in the sense that at least we are restarting the process through this text-based negotiation.
Yes.
So now is the time for the G4, as we were, Japan, Germany, and Brazil were called. You know, there has been a discord between G4 strategy and the African, what they call Esulveni consensus. And we have at times tried to coordinate, but it's not always worked out. Because the Esulveni consensus is now almost 10 years old, 2005. But since they have stuck to it, and there's, as Ambassador Shank was saying, there's no internal consensus as to who they want to project as a candidate. And they have not been flexible on the question of veto. Because the G4 at one point thought that if we give up the idea of the veto, we can get in as permanent members. The Africans were not so sure about it. And and they said they want two from Africa, according to Esulveni consensus. Probably there isn't room for that, and they have a demand for 6 or 7 non-permanent members, which again G4 tried to negotiate with. So now is the time to revive that. But the bigger point, I think, which must be centerpiece in our diplomacy is, look at the voting record, look at our overall foreign policy positions, our statements over the last several decades. We've always sided with Africa on the basis of solidarity. We have rarely, if ever, the Libya intervention by NATO was a mistake in the sense like we abstained when we should have voted against, because later on it was misused by France, Britain and the US to destroy Libya. But now, you know, in hindsight, if you see, most of the time we have sided with African people and sometimes with the elites and the states. So that record must be emphasized, because they should not fear, and I don't think they do, India ever becoming a permanent member. But the question is about who gets what. You know, if India gets in, then, you know, will there be enough room for African candidates to come in? You know, so it's that kind of pressure. So we'll have to do incentives, disincentives, and do bargaining again.
And it's important for us to get all 54 votes from the African continent.
So that's a whole regional block, and it's part of the voting process in the General Assembly. But on security questions, most often, if you look at the responsibility to protect this controversial concept, as I said, it's been mostly misused by Western powers. Even the ICC, there are some people who are asking, President Bashir of Sudan is here, why don't you arrest him? On this question, nobody disputes the fact that, you know, he committed war crimes or he directed them. But the point is that there is also regional bias of the International Criminal Court, and the Africans are being singled out at the expense of non-African cases where war crimes and crimes against humanity have happened, but they are being shielded by major powers. So we should not. So we should emphasize the fact that we have always been with Africa on these questions. We've always supported them diplomatically, and that should be the basis for us to get consent from them for both our interests to be met in the Security Council expansion.
Right. On that note, it's time for me to wrap up this discussion here on Insight. I'd like to thank all my guests for coming to the studios. It was a pleasure having you here. That's it for now in this edition of Insight. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.